a serial killer with over 100 lives on his hands, a criminal so brutal he killed his own father, cut out his heart, and chewed it raw. Yet when death came for him one morning in 2023, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians expressed their grief. How did a cold-blooded monster become a hero in the public's eyes? How did a serial killer earn a name of respect? The Punisher of South America. Today's story will take you into one of the most paradoxical and chilling cases in the history of world crime. Welcome to the Case Files, where we bring you real cases, crime stories both mysterious and fascinating from around the world. Today, we'll embark on a journey to explore one of the most controversial figures in Brazil's criminal history, a country where the line between crime and justice sometimes becomes frighteningly fragile. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the infamous case of Pedrinho Matador, the beloved serial killer, when a monster wears a hero's mask. This isn't simply a story about a serial killer. This is a mirror reflecting a broken society, where people have lost so much faith in justice that they're willing to glorify a cold-blooded murderer as a symbol of punishment. Join us as we explore this blood-soaked tale. Part 1. The Roots of Violence. The Mark from the Womb. In 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, a poor rural area in Minas Gerais state, Brazil, a child was born with a dent in his skull. That was Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a child whose fate seemed destined by violence from the very first moment. The dent on Pedro's head wasn't from a birth accident. It was the consequence of a brutal kick that his abusive father delivered to his pregnant wife's belly in a fit of rage. That kick nearly caused a miscarriage, and when Pedro was born, the permanent damage left a mark not just on his body, but on the child's soul. Psychologists and criminologists later believed that the brain damage from the womb contributed to shaping Pedro's unstable personality and violent tendencies. But was biology alone enough to create a killer? Or was the environment afterward the deciding factor? Childhood and violence. Pedro grew up in a family where violence was the only language his father knew. Pedro's father was an alcoholic who regularly got drunk and beat his wife and children. Beatings, curses, angry screams. These were the sounds young Pedro heard every day. But the environment outside wasn't any better. Brazil in the 1960s was a country sinking into political instability, with high crime rates, deep wealth inequality, and a weak legal system that couldn't protect its citizens. Street violence and gang warfare were everyday occurrences. For a child with brain damage, growing up with a hardened soul from family violence, the outside world only reinforced one single belief. Only violence could solve problems. Savage instincts revealed. At 13, Pedro showed alarming signs of cruelty and lack of emotional control. During an argument with his cousin, Pedro didn't hesitate to push him into an operating sugarcane press. Fortunately, the cousin escaped death, but the incident rang alarm bells. A storm was silently forming in the teenager's soul. Feelings of anger, resentment, and thirst for revenge always simmered inside Pedro, just waiting for an excuse to explode. And it didn't have to wait long. Can you guess what happened next? What turned a 14-year-old teenager into a killer? Part 2. The First Blood. The first murder at age 14. In 1968, when Pedro was just 14, what seemed like an ordinary incident became the trigger for a 40-year crime spree. Pedro's father worked as a security guard at a local school. One day, he was fired for being suspected of stealing food from the school kitchen. This news threw Pedro's family into financial hardship, but Pedro believed his father was wrongfully fired, that someone had framed him. In the mind of a 14-year-old with brain damage who grew up in violence, the concept of justice didn't come from courts or police. Justice had to be enforced by his own hands, and Pedro decided to do exactly that. With his grandfather's double-barreled shotgun, Pedro lay in wait outside City Hall. When the deputy mayor, the man who made the decision to fire his father, stepped out, Pedro didn't hesitate. A gunshot rang out, and the deputy mayor fell dead on the spot. That was the first life Pedro took. But Pedro didn't stop there. He believed there was one more person responsible, another security guard, whom Pedro suspected was the real thief who had framed his father. Pedro continued hunting and killed this person too. In just one day, at age 14, Pedro Rodrigues Filho became a killer with 2 lives on his hands. The path back was completely closed. Flight and entry into the criminal world. Knowing he couldn't stay in his hometown, Pedro fled to Mogi das Cruzes, an area in the outskirts of São Paulo. This was a completely different world, a paradise for criminals and underground activities. Here, Pedro's survival instincts and cruelty reached their peak. Pedro quickly plunged into the underworld, starting with drug dealing and robberies. The name Pedrinho, Little Pedro, began to be known in criminal circles not just for his recklessness, but for his brutal methods. Something special about Pedro began forming at this time. He didn't kill innocent people. His targets were only those he considered criminals, drug dealers, robbers, murderers, especially rapists and pedophiles. In Pedro's twisted mind, he wasn't a murderer, but someone enforcing justice. Before turning 18, Pedro had killed at least 10 victims. Were other criminals. One criminology expert once commented that Pedro was the perfect psychopath because he only killed those who did wrong things. But do you think killing only criminals made Pedro a hero? Or was this just how he justified his brutality? In the dark and chaotic world of São Paulo, Pedro seemed to have found a place to belong. But it was also here that he found something he'd never had. Love. And this love would push Pedro's brutality to a new peak. Part 3. Love, Tragedy, and a Vow of Revenge. Maria. The only light. In the brutal criminal world of Mogi das Cruzes, Pedro met Maria Aparecida Olympia, someone he truly loved. For the first time in his life, the cold-blooded killer seemed to have found a reason to live, a ray of hope for a different life. Maria and Pedro lived together, and soon after, Maria became pregnant with Pedro's child. For someone whose childhood was stolen, someone who only knew violence, the prospect of a family, of becoming a father, was perhaps salvation. Maybe this was the only chance for Pedro to escape the cycle of crime. Maybe the love for Maria and the unborn child could change him. But fate didn't give Pedro that chance. Horrific tragedy. Due to disputes in the underworld, a rival gang leader ordered Maria's murder as revenge against Pedro. They broke into the house and savagely killed her while she was carrying their unborn child. When Pedro returned and faced that horrific scene, the only woman he loved lying in a pool of blood, along with the child who never got to see sunlight, the monster inside him fully awakened. The pain of loss transformed into insane rage, a vow of revenge carved in blood. From that moment, Pedro Rodrigues Filho no longer fought for territory or money. He began a personal crusade, a bloody hunt targeting everyone involved in Maria's death and their unborn child. Bloody revenge. Pedro's revenge journey was systematic and brutal. He didn't just kill, he tortured for information, hunting down each member of the rival gang methodically. Pedro discovered that the gang leader, the one who ordered Maria's killing, would be holding a wedding. With a few accomplices, Pedro planned a bold attack, a direct assault on the wedding party. Amid the music and laughter of guests, in the festive atmosphere of a wedding, gunfire suddenly erupted. Pedro and his gang opened fire on the crowd, killing the gang leader and 7 others, and wounding many. It was one of the most horrific massacres in São Paulo's criminal history. The wedding massacre officially elevated the name Pedrinho Matador, Pedro the Killer, to a new level in the criminal world. But more importantly, it clearly defined his code. Pedro didn't kill innocent people, didn't target civilians. Only criminals were his targets. Did this code make Pedro more noble? Or was this just a moral distortion of a diseased mind? Part 4. The Brutal Peak. Filial Duty in Prison. Tragedy from home. While Pedro was drowning in revenge in São Paulo, another tragedy occurred back home. Pedro's abusive father, the one who created all his initial trauma in a drunken stupor, used a machete to kill his own wife, Pedro's mother. This news reached Pedro like a final knife cut, severing the remaining thread of human connection in him. Pedro's enemies now weren't just rival gangs. It was also the person who created him. First arrest. On May 24, 1973, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was finally arrested. At this time, he was only 19, but already had at least several dozen lives on his hands. Yet even with handcuffs on, Pedro's killing spree hadn't stopped. On the police transport vehicle, Pedro sat with 2 other criminals, including one convicted of child rape. Just by listening to the conversation between the criminal and police, Pedro learned of his crime. Quietly, right on the moving vehicle, with his hands cuffed, Pedro killed the rapist before the shocked and helpless eyes of law enforcement. When police opened the car door, they discovered a body. When asked why, Pedro simply replied coldly, "He was a rapist." That was Pedro's way of declaring to the world that, even if arrested, even if imprisoned, he would continue his work. Fateful meeting with father. Pedro was taken to prison, where his father was also serving time for killing his wife. The fateful meeting between father and son in prison had no forgiveness, only judgment by blood. Pedro meticulously planned revenge for his mother. He requested transfer to the same cell block as his father. And then, in a rare opportunity, he confronted his father, the one who created all the trauma in his life. What happened next became one of the most horrifying and haunting details in Brazil's criminal history. Pedro used a makeshift knife to stab his father a total of 22 times. But this number wasn't random. According to Pedro's testimony, it was 1 stab for each time his father stabbed his mother, plus 1 final stab. But the revenge didn't stop there. To ensure his rage was fully expressed, Pedro used the knife to cut open his father's chest, cut out a piece of his heart, and chewed it before spitting it on the corpse. This horrifically symbolic act wasn't just revenge for his mother. It was complete severance from his origins, a declaration that he had destroyed his past with his own hands and became a completely different creature. Can you imagine the level of rage and brutality it would take for someone to do that to their own biological father? Part 5. The Court Behind Bars. 42 years in hell. With the brutal crime of killing his father, Pedro's initial sentence of 128 years was increased. But the murders Pedro continued committing in prison raised his total sentence to nearly 400 years. Pedro's life seemed destined to end behind prison walls. But for Pedro, prison wasn't a place of punishment. It was a new stage, a new territory, where he could continue enforcing his own justice. Brazilian prisons are famously hellish. Overcrowded, violent, with gangs controlling every area and prison rules often having less value than jungle law. In that harsh environment, Pedro didn't just survive. He became a formidable force. Judge, jury, and executioner. Pedro turned himself into judge, jury, and executioner in prison. He specialized in hunting and punishing types of inmates he considered scum: rapists, child abusers, informants, and traitors. During 42 years in prison, Pedro Rodrigues Filho killed at least 47 more inmates. He used any available weapon, from makeshift knives, iron bars, to bare hands. Each murder was carried out meticulously by Pedro after he had tried and concluded the victim deserved to die. Other inmates both feared and respected Pedro. They knew that as long as they didn't violate his code, they'd be left alone. In fact, many saw him as a protector for weaker inmates from the oppression of stronger ones. In one interview, Pedro said he felt very excited and satisfied when killing criminals. His preferred killing method was stabbing and slashing with knives, a killing method requiring closeness, direct contact with the victim. This showed Pedro didn't just kill to enforce justice, but also to satisfy a deep, violent need inside. Brazilian law and a paradox. Although Pedro's accumulated sentences totaled nearly 400 years, Brazilian law at the time stipulated that no civilian criminal could be imprisoned for more than 30 years. This was one of the most controversial laws in Brazil's justice system. Pedro served a total of 34 years, 30 years for initial crimes, plus 4 years for crimes committed in prison. On April 24, 2007, after 34 years in prison, Brazil's most notorious serial killer was released. Can you imagine society's reaction when someone who killed over 100 people was released onto the streets? Part 6. Reintegration and Unlikely Icon. Life after bars. In 2007, after serving 34 years, Pedro Rodrigues Filho walked out of the prison gates. Brazil's most notorious serial killer was free. However, life outside wasn't easy. Pedro was arrested again in 2011 for charges of causing disturbances and inciting riots while still in prison. It wasn't until 2018 that Pedro was finally completely freed. At this time, in his 60s, many thought Pedro would choose a reclusive life to escape his past and enemies who might be seeking revenge. But Pedro did the opposite, something that shocked all of Brazil. From killer to social media celebrity, Pedrinho Matador, from a killer in the shadows, stepped into the light of the 21st century and became a content creator, a social media celebrity. With help from a friend, Pedro created a YouTube channel and TikTok account. There, he told his life story, not to brag about his exploits, but to, in his words, warn young people. In his videos, Pedro, with his somber appearance and slow voice, analyzed ongoing cases, commented on criminal psychology, and gave advice to young people at risk of falling into violence. He spoke about the meaninglessness of revenge, about the price paid for crime, and called on people to stay away from drugs and gangs. Social media earthquake. Pedro's appearance on social media created an earthquake. His channel quickly attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. His account on the Kwai video app had over 250,000 followers. On TikTok, the number reached 314,449,800 people. The public was deeply divided. One side vehemently opposed. They argued that a serial killer becoming an influencer was an insult to victims and their families. They believed Pedro was just exploiting his criminal past to make money and gain fame. Some victims' families spoke out strongly, claiming Pedro never truly regretted what he'd done. The other side supported him. They saw in Pedro someone who had truly repented, someone using his horrific mistakes to save others. For them, warnings from someone who had actually lived in crime's hell carried more weight than any moral lecture. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, in a strange way, became an anti-crime icon. He even wrote an autobiography, Pedrinho Matador, I Am Not a Monster, to once again affirm his transformation. Expert explanation. Criminologist Ilana Kasoy, who interviewed Pedro multiple times, described him as a charming, cheerful, easygoing, and intelligent person, a frightening paradox when placed next to the crimes he committed. Kasoy explained, Pedro Rodrigues Filho became famous because he's a reflection of Brazilian society. He captivates people in a country where only 10% of murders are brought to justice. This is the key to understanding why a killer was beloved. In a society where the justice system is too weak, where criminals brazenly run rampant without punishment, people tend to support anyone who enforces justice, even if that's a killer. Pedro filled that justice gap with his own brand of justice, a justice enforced with knives and guns, but at least it was justice in the eyes of those who had lost faith in the law. But could a killer truly change? Or was this just a new mask to hide the monster inside? The answer to this question would come one morning in 2023, in a way no one could have expected. Or Part 7. The Cycle of Violence. A Killer's End. The Past's Shadow. Pedro tried to write a peaceful final chapter for his life. He seemed to genuinely want to leave behind his criminal past, to become someone else, someone who used his experience to warn younger generations. But the past he sowed with blood and violence never truly slept. The cycle of violence he initiated at age 14 finally came back to claim him. Fateful morning, March 5th, 2023. On the morning of March 5th, 2023, Pedro Rodrigues Filho, 68, was standing talking with relatives outside his house in Mogi das Cruzes, the very place where he began his criminal career over 50 years before. Suddenly, a black car appeared and pulled up. Two masked men stepped out of the vehicle, not saying a word. One of Pedro's relatives later recounted, "One of the attackers told me, 'This isn't your business. Take your daughter inside the house.'" Gunfire rang out. The two attackers fired repeatedly at the 68-year-old man. Pedro Rodrigues Filho fell. But they still hadn't stopped. One of them moved closer and used a knife to slash Pedro's throat. The man who survived 42 years in the most brutal prisons, who personally ended over 100 lives, finally died on the street, in exactly the gang-style execution he was once part of. No peaceful ending. Pedro's death didn't surprise those who had followed his life. It seemed an inevitable ending, an accurate reflection of the saying, "Live by the sword, die by the sword." The man who spent his life seeking revenge ultimately became a victim of revenge. But who was behind it? A family member of one of Pedro's 100-plus victims? A criminal once hunted by Pedro who escaped? Or an old enemy from when Pedro was active in the underworld? Pedro's murder case remains unsolved to this day. São Paulo State Police said the suspects fled after committing the crime, and no one has been arrested yet. The perpetrators remain outside the law, leaving a final question mark on the question-filled life of Pedrinho Matador. Was this the final punishment for the very crimes Pedro committed? Or was this another proof of Brazil's legal system collapse, where even a famous serial killer wasn't protected? Part 8. Complex Legacy and Eternal Questions. Who was Pedro Rodrigues Filho? Pedro Rodrigues Filho is dead, but his story and complex legacy live on. So ultimately, who was he? A psychopathic monster? There's no denying Pedro's antisocial personality and extreme brutality. His actions, especially killing his own father and chewing his heart, exceeded all limits of humanity. A product of society? Pedro also can't be separated from the social context that created him. A child born with brain damage from family violence, growing up in an environment where violence was the only language, and living in a society where justice was a luxury. All these factors contributed to creating Pedro Rodrigues Filho. An unlikely hero? In the eyes of a portion of Brazilians, Pedro was someone who did what the justice system couldn't: punish criminals. When only 10% of murders in Brazil are prosecuted, when criminals can run rampant without fear of punishment, desperate people will seek justice anywhere, even from a killer. Lessons from Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life is a multi-layered tragedy, a frightening warning about how violence begets violence. Pedro is proof that when a society fails to protect its most vulnerable members and enforce justice fairly, it will create its own monsters. And sometimes, in the eyes of fellow sufferers, those monsters wear the face of a hero. Pedro's story also raises profound questions about the nature of justice. Who has the right to judge? When the justice system fails, do individuals have the right to enforce justice themselves? What's the boundary for punishment? Does killing criminals turn a killer into a hero? Can a killer be saved? Were Pedro's efforts in his final years genuine repentance, or just a new mask? The Brazilian paradox. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's legacy isn't about the number of people he killed. It's about the frightening paradox of Brazilian society, a society where the line between criminal and hero, between justice and revenge, has become frighteningly fragile. When Pedro died, hundreds of thousands of social media followers expressed grief. They weren't mourning a killer, they were mourning a symbol of justice they never received from the state. Criminologist Ilana Cassoy once said, "Pedro Rodrigues Filho is the face of Brazil, a country where people have lost faith in the system. The cycle hasn't ended. Pedro's death doesn't end the cycle of violence." Somewhere in Brazil, there are still children growing up in family violence. There are still young people having to seek justice themselves because the justice system has failed them. There are still criminals running rampant without punishment. And somewhere, there might be another Pedro Rodrigues Filho forming. That's the most frightening thing about this story. The story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Pedrinho Matador, isn't simply a story about a killer. It's a mirror reflecting society's darkest corners, where justice has become a luxury, and people must seek it with their own hands. Pedro killed over 100 people. He was a criminal, a cold-blooded monster. But he was also a product of family violence, of an unjust society, of a collapsed justice system. In his final years, Pedro tried to become someone else, tried to use his own mistakes to warn younger generations, but ultimately, the past caught up with him. He died the way he lived, by violence. The lesson from Pedro Rodrigues Filho isn't about glorifying a killer. It's about recognizing society's failures, the dark corners we often overlook. When children are abused and no one protects them, they'll grow up with wounds that never heal. When justice isn't enforced, people will seek it themselves. When the system fails, society will create its own monsters. And that's why Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story remains relevant today. Thank you for joining us on the Case Files today. If you found this story valuable, please share it, so more people can learn the lessons from one of the most paradoxical cases in world criminal history. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other intriguing cases we'll bring in upcoming episodes. Remember, justice isn't revenge. Violence only begets violence. And each of us has a responsibility to build a society where no one has to become the next Pedro Rodrigues Filho. See you in the next case. Stay safe and stay curious.